Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the Kyosho SST gearbox. The SST gearbox looks like this, or it looks like this. So this version of the gearbox was used in the Kyosho Pro X and the Pro XRT, which is an example that you see right here. So this was for the rear-wheel drive electric off-road buggies and trucks. And this version of the SST gearbox was used for their Rampage Pro and Outlaw Rampage Pro Nitro buggies and trucks. Or in my case, if you go back in my video history, the Rampage Pro E, I did an electric conversion of their Nitro buggy. And these SST gearboxes are interesting in theory, in that the differential is a three-piece differential with the diff gears, or the primary gear in the middle, with the diff balls embedded in the center gear here, and then these two side gears are what rotate differentially, and then they couple to either of these two output gears that go to your drive shafts. Okay, and then you have a normal input gear like this guy, kind of like an RC10 input gear, that goes to the top here. Now the problem is, if you put everything together, even with brand new gears, this is a brand new diff, or at least brand new gears, fresh out of the package, and you put everything together, you'll put all the gears, say, on one side, and you'll spin it, and it spins freely. And then you'll take this diff gear and put it on this side of the gearbox and spin these two gears, and everything spins freely. And then once you put the two halves together, you end up with significant binding in the gearbox. And I have tried a number of tricks to try to alleviate this binding. I actually tried taking this set of gears here, the set of output gears. I took this one and I actually trimmed it down in its width with a Dremel to reduce some potential binding between the top surface, the inner surface here of this gear, and the outer surface of the side gear here. But that didn't seem to do the trick. I tried actually filing each individual tooth on both of these output gears here, and also I had another set of diff gears right here which are used, and I tried filing these as well to try to improve the mesh. That didn't do the trick. And I've been playing with this for quite some time. I tried to do a bit of research online, and on the RC10 Talk forum, I actually posted a thread about the things I tried with the SST gearbox. And someone had mentioned to me that really what happened was, when Kyosho came out with this gearbox, the original molds were not very good. And so you would end up with all this binding. And then later on in their production run, they came out with supposedly, a revised set of molds, which result in a better, smoother mesh. Okay, so you wouldn't have as much bind in the gearbox, but you wouldn't be able to tell from package to package, because they kept the same part number. There was no apparent revision label on the part number. So I figured maybe there's something else going on here that I could try to fix. So what I ultimately found was that excuse me, if I take this diff gear here and I put it in, and then I take the input shaft. This is the standard input shaft as assembled, which has this little pin here on this side. Sorry if you can't see too well. That little pin there couples to the inner slipper hub that's part of the slipper clutch assembly. And then you have this little E-clip here that this bearing sort of sits against. And this whole thing goes into the gearbox housing, on this side. So that this is a 5x10 bearing that sits in this housing on the inside here. And that slots in. There's another 5x10 bearing right here that this end of the shaft slots into. And I figure that it seems to me that the problem was something with this input shaft, because if I left this input shaft out and I just kept the diff gear in there with the two output gears and I closed everything up, it kind of spun okay. So what I figured I would try is, if you look closely at the inside of the SST gearbox, the housing where this 5x10 bearing slots into is deep on the inside there. And then you can kind of see this little rim where the housing expands a bit. So this expanded part of the housing is an 11 millimeter diameter, whereas the inside there is a 10 millimeter diameter that fits this 5x10 bearing. So what I figured I would try to do is what I ended up doing here, where I took that E-clip out, took the pin out, put a 5x11 millimeter bearing immediately adjacent to the gears, and then put the 5x10 bearing back in, and then put this pin back in. So that way this input gear would be more stable, would have a lot less play, less wiggle on this side of the gearbox. Because if I, put this in on this side here, I think it's this one, yeah. If I put it on this side, there's actually a bit of play. I can force this to wiggle a little bit. And then what I do is I actually take out this 5x10 bearing on the other side of the housing. And I just leave essentially this end of the shaft floating, but I have an extra bearing on this side to hold everything in place nice and firm. And that actually works, this actually works quite well for holding it in place nice and firm. You don't actually need this bearing on this side when you have two bearings on this side. And what I found was when I take this bearing out and I let the input shaft float and I close everything together with the input shaft in there, I get a lot more free movement with the drivetrain. It's way better. It's not perfect. It's not like an RC10 stealth gearbox, which, despite all of my misgivings with a lot of team associated stuff, their stealth gearbox is immaculate. It's very smooth. It's very fast. This still has a little bit of friction, but it's substantially better than what you would have if you assembled this as the manual would have you assemble it. So again, all you have to do is take the 5x10 bearing on this side of the housing out. That's what would go to this end of the input shaft. And then take this part of the input shaft apart, take the pin out, take the E-clip out, put a 5x11 bearing in here, and then a 5x10 bearing, put the pin back in, and it slots back in. This 5x11 bearing doesn't get in the way of anything because this part of the housing here is deep enough for everything to kind of slot into place, and it fits perfectly fine. You do that and you're going to find that there's a lot better movement in this gearbox, and hopefully that will mean that you grind through fewer gears, because there are cases where people have actually ground especially the center diff gear out very significantly, and they've had to replace the gears. With that much friction in there, the gearbox will heat up. You can end up melting some gears. It's also really hard on the motor. The motor will heat up. You draw more current. So give this a try. If you have a Kyosho Pro X or Pro XRT or a Rampage Pro or something like that, check this out. Luckily, on my Rampage Pro E, when I did that build, I built it kind of as the manual would have you built it. Maybe I put one spacer in the gearbox somewhere under one of the bearings. I can't quite remember. But it spins relatively freely. So in that particular case, I got lucky. But if you happen to have an SST gearbox that binds, try this trick. It seems like it works. Okay, so I'm going to leave this at here for now, and thanks for watching.